The grand courtroom of the Los Angeles County Courthouse was abuzz with murmurs as spectators, attorneys, and legal clerks prepared for the civil trial of the day. The polished mahogany benches reflected the glow of the large chandeliers that hung from the ceiling, giving the room an imposing air of authority. Judge Richard Holloway, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering belief in traditional legal protocol, adjusted his robe as he took his seat behind the elevated wooden bench. He was a judge who commanded respect, a man who had seen decades of cases unfold before him. He prided himself on maintaining the integrity of the courtroom, and nothing irritated him more than disruptions, especially ones that, in his eyes, mocked the legal process. The tension in the room shifted as the side doors opened and a young girl, no older than 16, strode confidently into the courtroom. She was small in stature, her tailored navy blue suit slightly loose on her slim frame, yet she carried herself with an authority that made her seem larger than life. In her hands was a sleek black leather briefcase, and she walked with purposeful strides toward the defense table. Her dark brown hair was neatly pulled back into a ponytail, and her face was a picture of quiet determination. The moment she took her seat, the room erupted into whispers. Judge Holloway frowned. He cleared his throat and tapped his gavel sharply against the bench. "Order in the court," he commanded. As the voices died down, he turned his piercing gaze toward the young girl. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my courtroom?" His deep voice reverberated through the large chamber, carrying with it the weight of authority. The girl did not flinch. She stood, straightened her jacket, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, my name is Evelyn Carter. I am here in a legal capacity." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. A few attorneys shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged amused glances. The opposing attorney, a well-respected litigator named Gerald Matheson, leaned toward his client and muttered something under his breath, a smirk playing at his lips. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Legal capacity? I don't have time for games, young lady. This is a courtroom, not a mock trial competition." "Bailiff, escort her out." Before the bailiff could move, Evelyn raised a hand. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I am fully within my rights to be here. I have been granted special permission by the California State Bar under the Apprentice Legal Program, which allows exceptionally gifted individuals to practice under supervision. I am representing the defendant in today's case." The laughter died down almost immediately. The attorneys who had been whispering among themselves fell silent. Judge Holloway's brows furrowed, his fingers tightening around the handle of his gavel. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the defense's legal counsel is a teenager?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I am prepared to proceed." The judge exhaled sharply, glancing at the defense table where Evelyn's client, a middle-aged man named James Holloway, coincidentally, no relation to the judge, sat looking both astonished and hopeful. Judge Holloway turned back to Evelyn. "Very well," he said, voice laced with skepticism. "If you're as competent as you claim to be, explain to me the legal basis of your defense. Right now." There was a pause, but only for a second. Evelyn flipped open her briefcase, removed a well-organized file, and without missing a beat, spoke with remarkable fluency. "Your Honor, the case against my client, Mr. James Holloway, alleges a breach of contract regarding a disputed real estate transaction. However, under California Civil Code Section 1632, a contract is only enforceable if all involved parties fully understand its terms. My client signed an agreement that was later altered without his knowledge. Since these changes were material and not disclosed, the contract is voidable." The room was silent. The opposing attorney, Matheson, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. "Furthermore, the plaintiff has failed to provide substantial evidence that my client was aware of these modifications. Under California law, the burden of proof falls on the party seeking to enforce the contract. Without clear documentation or an affidavit demonstrating that Mr. Holloway agreed to these changes, the case should be dismissed." Judge Holloway stared at her. His initial amusement had faded, replaced by something closer to disbelief. He had expected her to fumble, to stammer, to show some sign of inexperience. But instead, she had presented a compelling legal argument in a manner that many seasoned attorneys would struggle to match. He cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, that was an impressive recital of legal principles. Evelyn met his gaze. It wasn't a recital, Your Honor. It was my defense. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even Matheson, who had entered this trial expecting an easy win, suddenly looked concerned. The judge tapped his gavel again, but this time there was no irritation, just intrigue. Very well, he said. Proceed with your case. As Evelyn nodded and took her seat, Judge Holloway found himself watching her with newfound respect. He had underestimated her. That, he realized, had been a mistake. And as the trial unfolded, he would soon learn just how much of a mistake it had been. As the trial formally commenced, Judge Holloway leaned forward, studying Evelyn Carter with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Though he had been taken aback by her articulate defense argument, he was still unconvinced that she could hold her own in a high-stakes trial. The opposing counsel, Gerald Matheson, sat confidently in his seat, flipping through his thick file of documents, his smirk returning as if he had already decided the outcome of the case. He had no intention of being bested by a teenage girl. Rising from his chair, Matheson adjusted his tie and took slow, deliberate steps toward the witness stand. Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to call Mr. Daniel Whitmore to the stand, he announced, his voice echoing across the courtroom. A well-dressed man in his mid-50s stood up and walked confidently to the witness box. Whitmore was the plaintiff in the case, a prominent real estate mogul who had accused Evelyn's client, James Holloway, of breaching a lucrative contract. He took his oath, sat down, and fixed Evelyn with a bemused stare, as if she were nothing more than a child playing pretend. Matheson began his questioning. Mr. Whitmore, can you confirm for the court the nature of the contract that Mr. Holloway allegedly breached? Whitmore nodded. Yes. We had a legally binding agreement for the purchase of a commercial property in downtown Los Angeles. The terms were clear. Mr. Holloway agreed to the price, the payment schedule, and the conditions of the transaction. But when the time came to finalize the deal, he refused, claiming ignorance of certain clauses that were always there. Evelyn listened intently, her sharp eyes scanning every document in front of her. She took meticulous notes, analyzing every word that left Whitmore's mouth. Once Matheson had finished his questions, he turned to Evelyn with an amused expression. Your witness, Ms. Carter, he said, exaggerating her name as if to highlight her youth. Evelyn rose, adjusting her blazer. She approached the witness stand with measured steps, maintaining her composure. She placed a document on the table in front of Whitmore and gestured toward it. Mr. Whitmore, is this the contract you are referring to? Whitmore barely glanced at the paper. Yes, that's the agreement. Evelyn nodded. And you claim that Mr. Holloway was fully aware of all clauses in this contract when he signed it? Of course, Whitmore scoffed. He had legal counsel, and all terms were reviewed before he signed. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Legal counsel? Are you referring to Mr. Alan Jacobs, the attorney who was supposedly representing my client at the time? Matheson, from his seat, interjected. Objection, Your Honor. What relevance does this have? Judge Holloway raised a hand. I'll allow it. But get to the point, Ms. Carter. Evelyn nodded and turned back to Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, could you confirm for the court whether Mr. Jacobs was present during the final signing of this contract? Whitmore hesitated for a fraction of a second. I believe he was, yes. Evelyn's lips curled slightly. You believe? Or you are certain? Whitmore shifted in his seat. Yes, he was there. Evelyn reached into her briefcase and pulled out another document. Your Honor, this is an official sworn affidavit from Mr. Alan Jacobs, stating that he never met with Mr. Holloway in person before the signing and was, in fact, out of the country on the date the contract was executed. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Matheson sat up straight, his smugness vanishing. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Is this true, Mr. Matheson? Matheson stood, his face pale. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Irregular? Evelyn interrupted. What is irregular is that Mr. Holloway was misled into signing a contract without his legal representation present. That means any and all claims that he fully understood the document are questionable at best. Judge Holloway looked at Whitmore, his expression now hard. Mr. Whitmore, do you have an explanation for this? Whitmore swallowed. I was told Mr. Jacobs had reviewed the document. Evelyn didn't let up. Told by whom? Did you ever personally confirm it? Whitmore hesitated too long. Evelyn turned back to the judge. Your Honor, a motion for this contract to be deemed invalid due to misrepresentation and lack of legal counsel on my client's behalf. Without his attorney, Mr. Holloway was unfairly disadvantaged and did not enter this contract with full knowledge. The case should be dismissed. Matheson shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this is a stretch. Judge Holloway raised his gavel. Quiet, Mr. Matheson. He stared at Evelyn for a long moment before shifting his gaze back to the contract. He picked it up, examined the affidavit, and then sighed heavily. Ms. Carter, he said slowly, I must admit, you are raising compelling legal concerns that cannot be ignored. Evelyn nodded but remained silent, her posture unwavering. Judge Holloway turned toward Matheson. You've got one chance, Mr. Matheson. Do you have any clear evidence contradicting Ms. Carter's claims? Matheson hesitated, flipping through his paperwork frantically. But there was nothing. He had relied on his opponent being inexperienced, never preparing for a real challenge. Finally, he exhaled sharply. No, Your Honor. Judge Holloway nodded. Then we have a serious problem with this case. He turned back to Evelyn. Ms. Carter, you may continue your defense. Evelyn gave a single, confident nod and returned to her seat. Though the case wasn't over yet, she had delivered a devastating blow to the opposition. As she smoothed out her notes and prepared for the next round, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary teenager. This was a legal prodigy, and she was about to shake the entire courtroom to its core. The tension in the courtroom was now palpable. Gerald Matheson, the seasoned attorney who had entered this trial with overconfidence, now sat rigid in his chair, his fingers nervously tapping the wooden surface of his desk. Judge Holloway, who had initially dismissed Evelyn Carter as nothing more than a misguided young girl playing lawyer, now watched her every move with unwavering attention. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the courtroom audience had grown into an audible buzz. Spectators were leaning forward, whispering to one another, trying to comprehend the shocking turn of events unfolding before them. Evelyn Carter, the teenage prodigy, remained calm. She had just dismantled the plaintiff's case, proving that the contract in question was fundamentally flawed due to misrepresentation and a lack of legal counsel for her client. But she wasn't finished yet. There was one last card to play, and it was the one that would ensure not just her client's victory, but also expose the deeper corruption at work. She stood, adjusting her blazer. Your Honor, I would like to recall Mr. Whitmore to the stand for further questioning. Matheson shot up. Objection, Your Honor. My client has already testified, and this is nothing more than an attempt to drag this case out unnecessarily. Judge Holloway studied Evelyn carefully, as if assessing whether she was merely grasping at straws or if she truly had another legal bombshell to drop. Finally, he nodded. I'll allow it. But, Ms. Carter, you had better have something substantial to justify this. Evelyn smiled. I do, Your Honor. Daniel Whitmore, a powerful real estate mogul, reluctantly made his way back to the witness stand. He had lost his smug demeanor. His polished confidence was cracking, and his posture now showed hints of unease. Evelyn approached with slow, deliberate steps. She picked up a document and placed it on the table in front of Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, do you recognize this document? Whitmore glanced at it, his jaw tightening. Yes, that's an internal memorandum from my company. Correct. Evelyn nodded. A memorandum that was never meant to be seen outside your company. Isn't that right? Matheson stood again. Objection. Relevance. Judge Holloway sighed. Ms. Carter, get to the point. Evelyn turned, holding up the document. Your Honor, this internal memorandum, which I obtained through a subpoena of Mr. Whitmore's company records, clearly states that they had full knowledge that Mr. Holloway had not been properly represented by legal counsel during contract negotiations. Not only that, but it also details a plan to intentionally rush the contract process before Mr. Holloway had the opportunity to consult a lawyer. The document specifically instructs employees to avoid giving Mr. Holloway any indication that his legal representative was absent during the final signing. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Whitmore's face went pale. Matheson immediately began flipping through his own notes, but he knew there was nothing he could say to undo the damage that had just been done. Evelyn turned back to the witness. "Mr. Whitmore, do you deny that this document came from your company?" Whitmore swallowed hard. He glanced toward Matheson, searching for help. Evelyn wasn't done. "One more question, Mr. Whitmore. Were you aware that deliberately misleading a party in a contractual agreement to prevent them from obtaining legal counsel is considered fraud under California state law?" Whitmore's lips parted, but no words came out. His attorney, Matheson, looked equally speechless. Judge Holloway leaned forward, tapping his fingers against his bench. "Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you answer the question." Whitmore exhaled slowly. "I was not fully aware." Evelyn held up a hand. "That's all I needed to hear." She turned back to Judge Holloway. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case entirely on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. Furthermore, given that this memorandum is clear evidence of corporate misconduct, I believe this court has every reason to refer this matter for further legal scrutiny." Matheson bolted to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's a child. We cannot allow this." Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. "Enough, Mr. Matheson. This child just presented more compelling legal arguments than I've seen from seasoned attorneys in years." He turned to Evelyn, his gaze unreadable. "Ms. Carter, your request to dismiss is granted. This case is over." The moment the words left his mouth, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators murmured excitedly, reporters who had been present frantically jotted down notes, and even members of the jury, who were no longer needed, exchanged stunned glances. Evelyn, however, remained composed. She had won. Her client was free of the unjust lawsuit, and Whitmore's corruption had been exposed. She turned to her client, James Holloway, who looked at her in complete awe. How did you do that?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Evelyn smiled. "The law is about understanding people, not just paperwork. I knew from the beginning that something about this deal didn't add up. Once I found the proof, the rest was just logic." Judge Holloway rose from his seat, stepping down from the bench. He approached Evelyn directly, his stern expression softening just a fraction. "Ms. Carter," he said in a lower voice, "I've seen lawyers 3 times your age crumble under pressure in this courtroom. What you did today was remarkable." Evelyn nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. But I was just doing what was right." The judge smirked slightly. "I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more of you in this courtroom in the future." With that, he turned and exited the chamber, leaving Evelyn standing there as reporters swarmed her, cameras flashing. The courtroom had just witnessed something historic. A teenage girl, underestimated and mocked, had walked into one of the toughest courtrooms in California and not only won her case but dismantled a fraudulent scheme in the process. As Evelyn walked toward the exit, she could hear the buzz of people still discussing the trial. Some called her a prodigy, others a legal genius. But to her, it was simple. She had fought for justice, and she had won. And as she stepped out of the courthouse into the warm California sun, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.